We are back on Taking Care of Business on Koerner Radio, News Talk, 1180, 1230 KGEO, and 1410 KERO. Or KERI, sorry about that. So, great interview with Eric. Eric Rush is a fascinating guy.
Yeah, he's pretty good, but I'm looking forward to this interview right now.
Yes, I am. By phone, we have a guest we've had on before, Dr. Walid Phares, who is the author of The Coming Revolution, Struggle for Freedom in the Middle East and the War of Ideas. And congratulations to Dr. Phares. He is now also the Senior Advisor on Foreign Policy and National Security for presidential candidate, hopefully the next president, Mitt Romney. Dr. Phares, welcome to Taking Care of Business.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the congratulations as well. It's a pleasure and an honor, and I hope in 4 days, next week, we will have President Romney.
Well, we hope next time we talk to you, you'd be part of the new Romney administration. That would be wonderful.
Well, thank you. We hope to see all Americans happier and more successful in the next 4 years.
You know, I saw a quote, I think it was on Facebook of yours. You said, we need a president who can turn a disaster into a recovery, not a recovery into a disaster. Was that...
Well, yes, it was prompted, of course, by the storm and how many millions of Americans were suppressed and depressed and were looking for recovery. It prompted the idea that what the kind of president we are looking for, we want to see next week, President-elect, are a man who can, or woman, in this case, President-elect Romney, hopefully, who can turn a disaster. This is a disaster, but if we have a strong economy, if we have strong economic structures, if we are competitive worldwide, this would reflect on any disaster. This is not going to be the last natural disaster. We know that. So the way for us to face the future is to have a strong economy based on trust and based on hope. And I think this should be the two titles for the next 4 years.
Well, Dr. Phares, I can already tell that, we've got you for a couple of segments here, but we're going to run out of time already, I can tell, because there's so many things I'd like to cover with you.
Yeah.
And one of them, before we get into presidential politics and Benghazi, which is the obvious, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about your book. I love that title, Author of The Coming Revolution. The Coming Revolution, Struggle for Freedom in the Middle East and the War of Ideas. What do you mean by the coming revolution? What do you see coming and happening in the next year or two?
Well, let me explain the title. This is an important title. This book was actually published 6 months before the Arab Spring. This is not this year. This was in summer of 2010. When I wrote this book, I came to the publisher and I said, there will be uprisings, there will be civil wars as in Syria and elsewhere. It was the only book in the world, not just in English, the only book that predicted the upcoming of what we saw, basically, in 2011, 2012. I titled it The Coming Revolution, The Struggle for Freedom in the Middle East, because it is not going to be very simple. And indeed, months later, 6 months, 7 months later, in Tunisia, in Egypt, and elsewhere, the revolts began. But in my book, I have projected that there will be rise of civil societies, meaning people in the Middle East had enough of dictators, but at the same time had enough of fundamentalism, of jihadism, just regular people. And that's because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, of course, but because of what they saw coming from the terrorists, and because of international globalization. People have access, more people have access to computer, to Facebook, to Google, to what have you. So this was the reason for why the rise occurred. But at the same time, if I may say quickly, there is a race. And I, anticipated that a race is going to exist between two forces in the Middle East. Those who did the early stage of the Arab Spring. Remember in Egypt, Tahrir Square, the youth, women, middle class, labor union, minorities, Christian minorities in this case in Egypt, they were the ones who pushed forth for that revolt. And then the other force, the jihadists, the Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Salafists, who are competing to take over. And unfortunately, because of our mishandling of the Arab Spring, and here we deal a little bit with politics, the Obama administration was not able to push forward with those forces of change. They partnered with the wrong people, with the Brotherhood, with the their allies in Tunisia and elsewhere, and that was all projected in my book.
Well, and on top of that, I mean, looking at the title, I think there's another coming revolution, and comment on this if you would, because of exactly what you just said. I mean, for example, Egypt, you've got the Muslim Brotherhood now in charge, But I think the people are going to uprise and say, like you say, we've had enough of the fundamentalism. We want to have a democracy, and they're going to uprise against these people. Do you see that coming?
You're absolutely right. I mean, you see what many in the mainstream media are not seeing. They don't understand. They think that this was the revolution. They think that the Brotherhood and the Salafists are the liberal Democrat and the social democrat and the river. No, these are the counter-revolution forces. In Europe, North America, and other places, we've seen, even Latin America, we've seen that there were first pushes for a democratic revolution. Then there was the counter forces from old regimes, from totalitarians. Even in World War II, after Nazism, you had the Bolsheviks for another 40 to 50 years. In the Middle East, we had a first wave. It was successful, meaning some dictators went down. Then the Islamists, the jihadists are taken over. And then you're absolutely right. What is brewing below the level of what we can see are those civil societies who are basically telling the Islamists and the Brotherhood, we're not going to accept you. And that's why you see a lot of demonstrations in Egypt, in Tunisia, even in Libya when we had the Benghazi incident. We're going to be talking about it soon. You had demonstrations by Libyans against the Salafists. And if I may add one thing, even before the Arab Spring, we saw two pushes against the Islamist forces. One in Lebanon, the Caesar's Revolution in 2005, pushing Syria and Hezbollah away from power, at least for a little while in Lebanon. And, of course, in Iran, in June of 2009, 1.5 to 2 million young Iranians pushing against the Ayatollah.
It's funny, Dr. Phares, I was going to be a history teacher before I went into the insurance business years ago, and I've always thought a great premise for a book would be that World War II technically wasn't over until the wall came down, because the premise for that was freeing Poland, and Poland wasn't free until the wall came down.
You're absolutely right. I mean, people did not understand that World War II actually did not end with the fall of Berlin, because the Soviets have invaded most of East and Central Europe. And you're absolutely right that it took a very long struggle, not always by military means. It took the dissidents, it took Lech Walesa, it took Václav Havel, it took also a Reagan and a Thatcher to be very firm in supporting these forces of freedom for finally the real wall to come down and for these people to liberate themselves. You're right.
Yes. Our guest by phone is Dr. Walid Phares, Fox Middle East expert, the author of The Coming Revolution, Struggle for Freedom in the Middle East and the War of Ideas, and now the senior advisor on foreign policy and national security for presidential candidate Mitt Romney.
Doctor, I have a question for you. It may be easy, it may be hard, but why does Obama always seem to choose the wrong side?
Well, it is a hard question, but we have ways to look at it from different perspectives. Perspective number one, probably we know little about it still after 4 years, his own ideology. He has chosen a path, an ideological path. Some, try to depict it as, less sympathetic to the Islamists or any other fashion. And his ideological view of things are that, the Islamist forces in the Middle East are the forces of progress. And of course, that is not the case. And he is discovering this in Iran and in Egypt and Tunisia. Second, advisors. And I know more about that than about the first aspect. We know that many of the advisors, and it's online, it's open sources, including those who came from the academic world, including from Ivy League, are Middle East experts or Islamic experts or experts on Islamic affairs who had programs that have been heavily funded by petrodollars, by programs funded by Gulf money. Now, that is a free market in America. It's okay. But the advice provided for the administration had consequences. Number one, they eliminated any study of jihadist ideologies. You know that our bureaucracy over the past 4 years was banned from using terms, from looking at terms, from considering that the jihadist movement, the Salafist movement, the Khomeinist movement are really the threat. It's not an issue of religion, it's an issue of the ideology. And second, when it came to the Arab Spring, and that was the biggest mistake in my sense, the Obama administration, the president, sided with the wrong forces, with the Brotherhood, with the Salafists. And when it comes to Iran, the reason for why we did not engage in supporting the students in 2009, because, again, pressure groups and advisors have advised the administration that we can still do business eventually and cut deals with the Ayatollah. So this whole business of not backing the Iranian public and people is driven from the notion that eventually the Ayatollahs are people we can do business with.
Dr. Phares, when we come back from the break, obviously the one thing we want to talk to you about is Benghazi. I mean, it's very maddening from our end of it. So let's take a break and come back in a moment, and let's talk about Benghazi. Our guest by phone, Dr. Walid Phares, will be back in a moment on Taking Care of Business on Koerner Radio, News Talk 1180.